Hi, it's time for a chime video. So what you're looking at is a very common NuTone chime power assembly used in a lot of NuTone two-note chimes starting in the late 1950s all the way up through around 1979 or so. This could be used in both two-note bar chimes, and it also can be used in two-note long tube chimes. And two-note long tube chimes have two tubes that ring. Sometimes there's a third decorative tube in the center, but that's just for looks. It doesn't have anything to do with how it sounds. There's always a lot of confusion about this particular power unit assembly because it's not like the earlier ones that they made, and it's not exactly like the later ones that they made, although it was made for a long time. So I thought I'd go over this today and show you how it's assembled, because we get a lot of these in for service, and normally when they come in they're missing pieces. So we're going to go ahead and take this apart. This is actually a new old stock one. This was manufactured probably in 1959 or 1960. We're going to go ahead and take it apart. It has sort of the normal arrangement. You have a little terminal board here, and of course it's marked how the wires would be connected. You have trans for transformer, front and rear, and this wires up like any conventional two-note door chime would be wired. Inside the cage here we have two electromagnetic coils. You have a large coil on the right for the front door, which is two notes, ding and dong, and a smaller coil on the left for the rear door, which is just a single note, so it would be dong. To take this apart, there are end caps on the brass tube that go through the coils, making it an electromagnet. And generally speaking, one of the two will be loose enough that you can get it off. This one actually came off fairly easily, so I'm removing the right-hand side one. I recommend that you figure out which one it is that's loosest, and that's the one that you should try to take off. If they're both reasonably stuck, what you do is you take a medium-sized flat screwdriver like this, and you can put it under the edge of the cap right here, and then use the body of the power assembly as a fulcrum to pry it up, and that'll pop the seal, and then the end will come off. Now, as I have said in all my chime videos, you must have something to put the parts in, because I guarantee you if you don't, and you don't contain them, you'll lose them. Parts for these are really hard to find because they're not common enough that they're just out there everywhere. So you must have a container. You have been warned. So we'll take the end cap off, put it in the cup, and then if you tip it out, you're going to find a spring. And the order of how this is assembled we'll document at the end of the video, but you have a long spring on the right hand side, and then if you tip it out, you have the plunger assembly, and then if you tip it out one more time, there's a second spring which is much shorter, like that. So these chimes have more working parts than most other types of chimes. As for the rest of this, it's your pretty standard NuTone electromagnetic solenoid assembly. It has a brass tube in the center, and you clean the inside of the brass tube, just like I show in all the other videos about chimes with solenoids, with the sandpaper and the lighter fluid and all like that. So go watch one of those videos, because I'm not doing that again today. Now this one, even though this is new old stock, this was actually in an original NuTone parts bag, and it had never been used. It had sat around on someone's shelf for so long that the inside of the brass tube was all oxidated, and the plunger didn't want to move. So I took it all apart, I cleaned out the inside, I cleaned the plunger itself, and now it slides in freely, and I'll show you that when we put it back together. So here are the three working parts of the chime. You have the right hand spring here, you have the plunger assembly with the two tips on it, one for the first note and the other one for the second note, and then you have a second shorter spring here. Now again, this was a new old stock one, but because it was so old, the plastic tips on the ends of the plunger, they were actually already broken off, and that was just from being inside the chime. But if you figure that this was made, let's say it was 1960, just to make it easy, that means it's almost 60 years old, and so the plastic has every right to break. So what did I do? Well, I cleaned up the plunger, the outside surface of the plunger itself, as I show in other videos, and then I removed the broken bits of the original tips, and then I fashioned and installed new tips, which we'll go over at the end of the video. Once I've done that, then it would slide in freely. The springs are fine because they're not bent or crushed or mashed or damaged in any way, because again, it's brand new. So once I did all of that, it was ready to be reassembled again, and all you have to do to reassemble it is you have to put the short spring in first because it goes on the left, or if you took it off, the end cap off this side, it would be the last part to go in. So the short spring, I guess another way to say it is, the short spring goes on the rear side of the assembly. It goes here on the left hand side. So what order you reassemble it in depends on which end cap you took off. So the short spring goes on the rear side, and then the plunger assembly has to go in. Now, one of the things that makes this plunger assembly unique is that the length of the tips are different. The tip for the rear door is shorter than the tip for the front door, which is longer. So you have to put it in the right way around. If you don't, it won't work properly. So the short end goes towards the rear. So we'll put this in, and if you watch, you might be able to see as I drop it in on the spring, it will bounce. Well, it's a little hard to see it bounce because the spring is short, but it does. And then we'll put the long spring in there, and then we have to put our end cap in, which was in our cup, so we didn't lose it. Now, this end cap, like a lot of these chimes, the end cap is made out of brass also, and on the side of it, which is kind of hard to see, right here, there's a little tiny crack. And that just happens from the force of being pushed onto the tube in a solenoid, and that's what made it fairly easy to take off. Now the problem with this is, if we slide this on like this, it's a fairly loose fit. I can actually turn it with my fingers, which is not great, because what can happen is every time the chime is activated and the solenoid pushes the plunger to the right, it hammers against the inside of the cap, and eventually it'll slowly get pushed off, and then it'll fall on the floor and the spring will fall out, and then you'll lose it, and then you'll be unhappy. So what I do with these, the easiest, least invasive way to do this, which is I'm going to actually do this right now, is I'm going to use a little super glue. This is the kind I like. This is the super glue ultra gel control type made by Loctite. Not a sponsor of this video, just the kind that I happen to like. Super glue comes in a lot of different consistencies. A lot of it that most people are familiar with is runny like water, and that's not a really good kind for what we do. I like the gel kind better because it kind of stays where you put it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back this off, just the end cap off the tube just a little bit, and then I'm going to put 2 little dabs of super glue on the tube, one there and one there. You don't need a ton, and you don't put it all the way around, and you don't take this off all the way and put it all the way around and put a whole bunch and then push it on, because the goal is to just make it hold in place, and after that dries for 24 hours, it will do that. If you put too much, if you overdo it, and you ever need to take this off again, you may not be able to get it off. So you don't need to overdo it. This is definitely one of those less is more type projects. And that's all there is to this type of NuTone 2-note power unit assembly. Now let's go over all the specific details, because that way it's documented and you'll all understand what you got. Here's a drawing of our plunger assembly. So here in the center we have the actual plunger. It has one hole in each end where the tips are inserted. The overall length of the plunger is 35.3 millimeters. The spring, the short spring on the left-hand side is 13 millimeters long. The long spring on the right-hand side is 29.25 millimeters long. And the tips, which are represented by the blue rectangles, the right-hand tip, the long one, is 13.2 millimeters. And the left-hand one is 11.6 millimeters. The measurement of the tips is from the end of the plunger to the end of the tip, does not include the depth of the hole in the plunger that the tip gets inserted into. So this gives you some idea, if you have to replace tips on yours, how it should be done. As I show here, the original design, the tips were made out of plastic, and in the opening of the hole in the end of the plunger, there are little serrated threads. How this was done exactly, I don't know, but it's obvious when you take some of these apart that the plastic tip was somewhat threaded into the hole in the end of the plunger. The original tips never went back all the way to the back end of the hole in the plunger. They were about threaded in about halfway. When we make replacement tips, because this threading in is inherently a weak spot in the design, and what happens to these over the years of striking the tubes or the tone bars is the plastic tips strip out on the threads and they slowly get driven back into the opening in the end of the plunger. So what I do when I make tips are I make them longer and I insert them all the way to the back of the opening in the plunger so they're sitting against the metal. Again, when I glue them in, I use a little drop of the super glue because that holds them in well. You do have to let it dry overnight, so make sure it's really secure. And once it's dried and secure, then I measure from the end of the plunger to the end of the tip for whatever length I need, and that's where I cut them off. Once you cut them off, you should sand them so you don't have a blunt end on the end of the tip. It should be a little bit pointed, not a whole lot, just a little bit, because it helps concentrate the force into a smaller diameter. So these are the measurements for the type of plunger in this type of power assembly. I hope you found this interesting, and perhaps for some of you it will be helpful. If it is, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube because that helps us. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and when you click on the bell, click on it to receive all notifications. And every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.